I will start by saying that my research is about designing engaging technologies to foster nature connections and inform wildlife and conservation with audio. And I want to set the stage first a little bit because I do realize I have very diverse audiences joining in today and give a little bit of context. So my research started with this ambition to study a bird. It all started with a bird, but I realized I needed to understand people. And I did not know what tech design was, but I did know what birding was, and I did know about practices. And I started learning about design and the need to reflect on what it is that we do, why we do it, how we do it, and who we do it with, and started thinking about how that informs the way we think about technology and the way that it configures technology and what the outcomes of that are, and how we should reshape the way we think about science to engage broader groups of people, whether through citizen science or even more traditional ecology. It's all collaborative. And so acknowledging that whether my insights are for citizen science or nature engagement more broadly, or ecologists specifically, it's all one and the same because we all have the same struggles at the end of the day. And then all of that was to inform a more sustainable future for the birds because I care about the birds, but that of course helps people as well. So it comes full circle. Just for a very quick overview. So I started out by preparing my research by looking at motivations and backgrounds, and I'm giving you a bit of a journey of what we're going to talk about. I will share some research shifts that I experienced in that time and my design research as it came to be formed and the focus of that research. Then I'll go into the investigations that I did. Please note that the investigations with asterisks next to them are individual publications. There are 4. And so the first exploration was around understanding conservation practices. The second was around understanding the usability of ecosounds. I'll talk about what ecosounds is in a bit, but it's a system for analyzing acoustic data, and that's audio recordings from nature. And then my third exploration is around thinking about how do I develop methods to elicit knowledge from people, what they know about nature and sound and their various experiences with those things. And then applying that to thinking about the experiences of matching media. So how do we match sound with the way that it looks? And how can we elicit an understanding of people, but also how to shape those types of media differently to be able to make sense? And so then I created a prototype that I explored more deeply. And all of this very much was iterative. So each study, even if it involved different people, they informed each aspect of the next study. And so I looked at playful and gameful interactions and how people experience different types of things that I designed. And I'll explain what each of those are a bit more in a moment. So then I articulate the research contributions that I've made, specifically honing in on the design research aspects in particular, but I do share some conclusions that are broader scope in kind of thinking about my future vision for design and ecology work together. And again, the ones with asterisks are published independent studies. Preparing for my study was a map that was nowhere near this clean. It was very messy. And I want to just start out by saying I took a pretty specific approach to design that I'll get to in a moment, but it took some time to work that out. So I was motivated, and the background that set the stage for me doing this work by the fact that I knew that eastern bristlebirds were in trouble. I knew a lot about their background through my work at the time with the local group of BirdLife Australia. And these birds are a very sneaky species that lives in really thick grasses, and they have tunnels that they weave within. They're virtually flightless, and they sing, but primarily during breeding season, which is only a few months of the year. So they're tricky to find and they're endangered. And so a lot of their northernmost populations have now gone extinct. They're gone. And so they were trying to find where the birds were. And it was suspected there was about 40 individuals left for that population in the north. So knowing about that and knowing that they used a detector dog to find individual birds, I thought, well, can we validate what the dog is telling us if we use acoustics? And so that was what prompted the work originally. And I knew that acoustics was kind of a question that I had in my mind because I'd heard a lot about it, but I really didn't know a lot about it. And it was sort of seen as a magic bullet when you read the literature. And I really wondered, well, what about getting through that data? Because when I started looking at citizen science, it was growing, and I looked at nature-focused design studies, and they looked at devices that might have some embedded nature sounds, but they didn't look at how people experience and make sense of those sounds. And so I really was wondering what happens with that data. I know it collects huge amounts of data continuously if you chuck a recorder in the wild. And I looked at citizen science and online projects that involve classifying different types of things. So it might be animals in photographs, or it might be bats in audio, but those audio focused projects actually have very relatively low engagement. They still do have some outcomes. So I don't mean to say that they don't do anything, but relative to a project like Snapshot Serengeti, where people look at pictures of African animals, they were much less engaged. So I had a lot of questions about, well, how can we make this more enticing and useful for people? And there were only two systems to look at for audio specifically. And one of those platforms is Zooniverse, and it was developed by a group of engineers originally for Galaxy images, and they converted some aspects to classify sound, but it was not originally designed for sound. Contrast to that, EcoSounds is a system at QUT that was specifically designed for sound by computer engineers and computer scientists, and particularly e-scientists, which are scientists driven by data interests. So audio represented a really intriguing complexity because it's a lot more difficult than visual data to make sense of. And so they developed a platform to explore different ways of looking at that data and providing the potential for people to analyze their own data through the system. So with those systems in mind, I went forward in my research. It turned out, though, changing Zooniverse and EcoSounds was not going to be feasible. And that took me quite a long time to come to that determination. And I'll explain some of the processes that I went through to learn that. But I tried to create a lot of stopgap materials in particular for EcoSounds because Zooniverse engineers that I spoke to said, look, we're not investing in changing the audio components because we're really busy doing other things that are visual. And EcoSounds, I was under the impression that it could be changed. And so I created a bunch of, independent websites and different data sheets and things to support individual people in the early stages of my research to use the system from that Bristlebird team that I was going to work with. And you'll hear more about them in a moment. But at the end of the day, they didn't support people, but I needed to learn to see the fortuitousness and failure. And it took a while, but I did. And I actually learned a completely different way of knowing that I hadn't fully even appreciated, not knowing what design research really truly was when I came into the investigation. So gradually, I fundamentally shifted my research and my thinking and stayed with that struggle to find a shift for my way of knowing because I also didn't want to dismiss my background in ecology. And I wanted to, even if stuff that we find eventually was not going to be immediately applied, I wanted it to be able to inform future ways moving forward. So, oh, that looks like it's redundant. Sorry about that. Anyway, invaluable social orientations came out of this. So I did not realize when I started this, I was quite naive, but coming from the ecological background, I did not fundamentally know the difference between kind of generalizable ways of knowing in science and the way that we think about that and the philosophies that underpin that. And then I learned that there's entirely different ways of knowing that are much more situated, contextualized. So my research is very much positioned in that space of really understanding the practices and needs of individual people. And then once you really understand that and have a deep understanding of it, you might be able to explore the generalizability aspects of it. So the one sad part, the cost of this shift for me was the fact that I wouldn't be directly informing the conservation of eastern bristlebirds, which, as an ecologist and conservation passionate person, was a pretty hard pill to swallow, but I came around. So in my design research, I looked at qualitative, creative ways to explore possibilities and the unknown. So specifically looking at what do we not know and what do we need to know. And it's very difficult to ask people what they don't know. So you need to come up with really creative ways to elicit an understanding of what people do and don't know. And I took an ethnographic approach for some of my research with the Eastern Bristlebird Recovery Team. So that's the group of people that are specifically looking to save that northern population and using the detector dog that I mentioned earlier. And I did usability testing, although at the time I didn't know that it was usability testing with EcoSounds to find out that the changes that I would have needed would have been far too substantial to be able to make that feasible. And so I did a lot of exploratory sessions with people exploring media, but really realized I needed to go bare bones because one thing I did learn through using EcoSounds was if you have a technology that doesn't work well and you're trying to learn how people experience interacting with media, they're going to be focused on the struggle they're having navigating. And so they're not going to really be able to focus and give you detailed stories about their experiences with nature and things like that, because it's distracting to use something that's difficult. So to avoid all of those tensions and to avoid developing technology just for prototype purposes as an ecologist, realizing there's cost to everything we create, I wanted to go as low fidelity prototyping, and prototyping is creating kind of ways to explore and test ideas as possible. So I did a lot of paper and audio playing based prototyping and PowerPoint because that's something people have readily available. And so my research focus for the overall overarching aim and research question is how to design enticing and informing audio encounters for learning about the calls of eastern bristlebird and informing conservation. Sorry, I just got to move that. There we go. Conservation of the species through citizen science. And my objectives were to uncover possibilities and challenges for in conducting transdisciplinary research with participatory mindset in the conservation context. So I just want to unpack this a little bit. Transdisciplinary research, for those who may not know, is research that incorporates not just multiple disciplines, but also practical knowledge of people that may not be in academia. And a participatory mindset is actually including those people who you expect to influence in the future with whatever you create, have them involved in co-creating in that process with you. Have them along in the journey, informing and guiding what it is that you do, which is what I did. And so my second objective was to reveal the conservation practices, remembering from a social lens rather than an ecological one, of the Eastern Bristlebird Recovery Team, that northern group, and their experiences with trialing audio technologies because they had not yet trialed them before, but were very keen with the idea when I chatted with them about it. And then I needed to develop methods for eliciting people's knowledge, as I mentioned before. And I wanted to look at their knowledge, experience, and sense making about Eastern bristlebirds and the broader sights and sounds of nature that I engaged them with. And then I needed to look at how to design audio encounters that are both enticing and informative because ultimately I wanted my research to be still ecologically grounded to inform future conservation efforts if those designs actually get taken up and put into systems down the track. And then I wanted to understand the human knowledge that people have about bristlebirds, but also what insights can be generated about bristlebirds through these audio engagements that we didn't have before. So it's kind of a pre-post knowledge question. And now we're going to dive into that investigating stream where I'll talk about the various papers that I've written and the different explorations that I did. So when we look at the conservation practices, I looked and worked very closely with the Eastern Bristlebird Recovery Team for 3 years. And I did ethnographic work, which means really I observed what they did in situ, meaning in place, wherever they were, went multiple locations with them, went in the wild to see bristlebird sites, and observed what they did without interfering. Although, because I had a background in conservation and ecology, they did invite me to be a participant observer. So I did do some interactions with them. And I interviewed them through semi-structured interviews. So rather fluid, not rigid questions, but letting them kind of guide things as appropriate so that I could learn as much as possible. And I also observed that bird and I thought about, okay, we need to think about where we put these sensors, and we deployed a bunch of sensors in different places. Now, some of their habitat is incredibly rugged, and I am not physically capable of going there. So I coordinated with the team, gave them all the technologies they needed and guidelines, and we really worked together to do different aspects of that work. And then we co-explored the recordings in different ways, and I'll get into more of that later. But I also looked at their digital correspondence with me and with others and things that they share, because that can share a lot of insights about how they cooperatively work, which is a really important thing to think about when you're looking to design future technologies to support people doing that cooperative work and enable new things to happen. And I looked at the way that they created documents. So there's lots of different document types that they create because they do breed these birds in captivity. They have husbandry documents, they have documents discussing genetics and everything you can imagine they that they could be discussing as potential conservation approaches. They are, and it was an incredibly innovative team to work with. And then I took all of that information and I did what's called thematic analysis. So I did really careful coding through all of the interviews and all of the textual stuff. And then I did memos that I wrote after all of the different encounters. And then I included those in the thematic analysis. And from that, I came out with pillars of design. And there's themes as well that informed the pillars. So it's kind of a multi-layer process. And that's going to be true for all of my studies. So I encourage you, if this stuff is intriguing to you and you want to know more, definitely go check out my thesis and my papers that are already out in the wild. So, the pillars that came out of this is it's super important to understand and discern the goals of all of the different stakeholders involved in that team, because they don't all have the same knowledge, they don't all have the same motivations, but it's really important that you can figure out where the tensions and the uniting aspects align. And we also learned that they have some knowledge, but they need tools to support improving those skills. Because one person, for example, quizzed me on if I could tell if an individual bird was calling at the sanctuary, because she already knew those birds to the individual, whereas the gentleman who does all the field work looking for them in the wild knew all of these different calls, and they shared different insights with me. And so they need information to be able to share that knowledge with each other as well, because one's in the field and one's at the sanctuary all the time. They actually have no idea if they know the same calls or insights or not, because they don't have the tools to be able to assess that. And they need information facilitation exchanging tools as well. And so then also it became very evident that the people that are involved in this team, and some of them are even volunteers, but whether they're in a professional or volunteer role, everyone is flat out. And so they need tools that are going to be not just useful for them, but useful to extend well beyond the team. Because it's just not going to be sustainable to adopt yet another technology that does take quite a lot of time to look through the audio and make sense of it. Even if you're doing machine learning, you still have to have a really good, solid, validated set of data to train the AI. They're not going to be able to do that, and they may not have the skills to do that in computer science. So, having the ability to extend that team and extend knowledge and share knowledge is really, really important and fundamental for them. And they really need designs that can be for engagement and usability, but also have impact. So ultimately, they're driven by the impact of being able to inform conservation. So we can't forget that. And that is kind of an unusual area in design to be looking at. As I mentioned before, I did explore using eco sounds both on my own and with them. And you can see this is my happy early days first sensor deployed. I was super chuffed. Happy days. And then I coordinated that deployment of a whole heap of wild sensors into the wild as well. And we even learned that I screwed up my first deployment and I had some settings wrong. So I had to go back, but I was still happy as. And we're doing it together at the sanctuary. And then we put a bunch of Google spreadsheets that I coordinated with each team member manually. I tried Excel first, that didn't work. Then I tried Google spreadsheets and I tried to engage with them to go through that data and provided them little special links to get certain little subsets of data. And it was all kind of laborious to coordinate and pretty unsustainable. And ultimately, they didn't look at the data, but I looked at the data a lot, and it was incredibly laborious. I went through and I annotated over 3,000 calls to try and understand them, but it just was not a sustainable thing to do because I was not doing an ecology project. And so I ultimately felt really sad because I realized eco sounds would not be able to probably be used on a global online citizen science project like I hoped that it would eventually. Because at the start, I thought that this early work that I was doing would inform a redesign of the system, and then I would be able to deploy a large scale project once things got gussied up. And then the idea was I would go through and actually get ecological insights from the data from citizen science, because that is what traditionally happens with that Zooniverse platform. And that is how I knew coming into design research, online citizen science to be done. And you'll see later I've changed my thinking on that, but we'll talk about that more in a bit. It was time to pivot. And so we looked at these spectrograms, and I should have mentioned before, spectrograms are visualizations of sound, and they are on frequency over time. So the time axis is going to be on the bottom, and then on that side is the frequency. I meant to mention that earlier, but this is 30 seconds worth of time being shown. And there's a bunch of bristlebirds in there, and there's some other crows, and I can still tell you because I just remember what they look like now. But ultimately, because nobody was using that system, and when I did use it with them in person, it was so difficult for them. I ended up printing out things that I had annotated and asking the expert person that knew all the wild calls and having him manually write, manually tag the calls for me to teach me about the birds because I had never heard a bristlebird before this. So he wrote here, for example, standard male. He put M, and so I needed to learn his language and the way that he conveyed information, but M means male and adult. And then he had questions around, gee, is this a pardalote? Is it a whistler? Or is it EBB, which is short for Eastern bristlebird? So I learned a lot even about his tagging processes and what future systems would need to be able to help conservation with a species like bristlebird. And then he said, well, this is an agitated alarm call. And this one, oh, this is probably a rosella, which I had actually accidentally annotated incorrectly as Eastern bristlebird because I was guessing, right? And I didn't necessarily know the really far away calls. And king parrots can surprisingly sound like bristlebirds. And then he listed this one as like a really common wild bristlebird call. So that was very helpful. And then I moved to the next study, which is looking to develop that method of eliciting knowledge. And I worked with four solo individual people and one pair and a group. And we did really interactive interviews. And I printed a piece of paper with a spectrogram on it, which I'll show you in a moment, but they're looking at it here. You can see them working together. And then again, I thematically analyzed the outcomes. But I want to show this to you. This is called a false color long duration spectrogram. And so it's just a fancier one of what I had shown you earlier, but I want to explain something interesting about it. You're looking at 24 hours worth of data here. And so it started at 10 a.m. and it ended at 10 a.m. And right in the green bits there is dusk versus dawn. Now, I'd always been told as a birder, dawn is the time when birds are loud, right? But if you look at this, you can see that they're even louder at dusk. And that's because I was at a sanctuary, right? And there's lots of corellas around, a type of cockatoo, and there was a roost tree, and they are incredibly loud at night. So it just goes to show that how even in ecology, even if we don't think about it, we can in the same way, we contextualize the way the animals live, and in a way, I'm contextualizing the way people live. So it's a nice little parallel for me to go, oh yeah, well, of course, that makes sense because of the context of where this was recorded. But then I would ask people, what do you make sense of this? And really explored how they might understand these types of spectrograms. And I showed them a whole heap of them. And I just want to ask you guys, just a little pop quiz. Any idea what that might be in the middle for those of you that have never seen one of these before? In the middle, that big pink band, if that's nighttime, just to orient a little bit. Any guesses? No? All right. Well, it's crickets.
Crickets. We got crickets from the floor here from Alex.
Good one. Good one. Thank you, Margot. Yep, good memory on that one. All right. So I just want to show an example of this as well. So somebody said, wow, that's so cool that you can see this on a 24-hour scale. And what they were looking at is that long duration spectrogram, but I was showing them different habitats and they saw this one. And they were like, this one looks very interesting, low frequency. And they heard it because I played it for them on a regular grayscale. But because this is compressed when you're looking at it on that fancy color one, you can't play that. It's just a visual. So when I could go back and forth and kind of play the sound, they had the opportunity to learn different things from it. And I'm curious if anyone knows what that lovely little bird is. See, I guess somebody.
From Dave Watson here, the boo book.
Boo book, nice one, Dave. Good one. So, yep, it's a boo book owl. And my buddy Tom gave me that cute picture because I didn't have any. All right, so you're getting a sense for the type of interactions that I did with people. I wanted to include that just to give you a little taste of the types of experiences we would have. And my methods were, so then I got into the next study and the methods were carried forward, right? So you saw that interaction, but then I thought, okay, I need to know more than just birders' knowledge. I need to know experiences of people that may not be interested in birds yet, but could be in the future. And I also learned through those early experiences and workshops that I haven't published, the birders may not be my key audience, which was quite surprising. I targeted them first based on previous literature around the potential of virtual birding, giving them access to this type of audio and way of engaging with it. But in my workshops, they were kind of like, well, unless you're going to give me the ability to learn very specific calls that I want to know, I'm really probably not going to spend a lot of time looking at this. And it made sense, and I should have known that because I am a birder, but nevertheless, everybody's different. There's a few people that are keen beans for sure, but I wanted to see if there were other people that might be interested. So I really started to broaden out, and I also wanted to compare if people interacted with things in a different way and how knowledge was influencing their experience. So I recruited a bunch of people to engage with a bunch of media. And again, I made it as low prototype as possible, paper-based audio recordings. And I made kind of a little matching game. And what makes it a game is that it was a bit structured and there was kind of an end goal of matching the correct media together. And so what I included, I'll show you in a moment because I'm gonna have you experience what they experienced. But I had both mixed in group individuals as before, and I did thematic analysis. And as you can see, some people were really engaged and kind of sharing the images and things back and forth. And I had some vicious debates. It was so much fun. It was just like being in the field with a bunch of birders, really wanting to know what it was that they were hearing. So the lessons around this are the benefits of media assortment. So including a bunch of different media is quite helpful. It elicits enthusiasm because people knew different things and it conjured different diverse forms of knowledge. It helped them to solve ambiguity if they had lots of information in front of them, and they could solve through cooperation a lot of the times. And it also provided lessons for the need to facilitate long-term engagement. And the ideas that came from that were growth of knowledge with purpose and how to do that, and diversity in tasks and difficulty. Because if it gets too difficult, there's a point to where, we like difficult things. And it's like birders who learn to identify birds by sound. That is a skill. It's not an easy thing. And a lot of people think all citizen science is easy, but that's not actually the case. It has to be underpinned by interest, though. And you still want to have a mixture. And even a birder, if they know a call, it feels really good to be able to identify those birds. But then when they get a tricky one, it's like a little puzzle. So mixing that is really important. And being able to customize the complexity of the interactions would be really helpful as well. And then collaborative puzzle solving has been quite a good insight to gain from that as well. So I'm going to just show you what they saw in a digital form rather than on paper. And you'll get to hear the calls and note that I'm showing you specific call spectrograms that have one call each that's the primary focus. And I'm going to show you a mixture of pictures and species distribution maps. So the range of where the different species live, and then I'll play their sound. And you can see they're all mixed up. And you can see if you can match them up. Okay, so that's the way that they would be presented information. And I did vary how I presented the information based on who I was working with because I didn't want it to be too easy for birders. And I knew it'd be too hard if I started with matching spectrograms and sound for novices as well. And so there's the distribution map. So just imagine if you're working with me for a good hour and we could have a big long chat about it. And then I would take that and I would thematically analyze your sharings with me, but then I would be looking at it from a completely different perspective of how I could help to create something in the future. All right, now we're going to jump into the fifth and final exploration that I did that had some of my favorite insights. And this was the Bristle Whistle Challenge. It was actually a prototype that included both gameful, like you saw before, and I've mentioned before, those are structured interactions that have kind of a goal. You have a task that you're meant to complete when you do those things. It's more than just badging. It's more than gamification where you just chuck a badge on something and give people points. That's sometimes referred to as pointsification. I wanted to avoid all that because I wanted to understand how people make meaning of things and how they experience interacting with the sound itself. I didn't want them to get distracted with points or discouraged because some people do find actually using those types of leaderboards and badging and whatnot kind of discouraging. So I just avoided all of that. And then I did gameful design but also I included in the same prototype some playful design. And playful design is when you create interactions for people that are intended to elicit curiosity and allow people to explore without a specific task. You're not trying to give them any kind of goal. You're just seeing what they'll do and try to learn from those insights. So one of the first tasks that I had was to have people actually, and here you're actually seeing some pages from the Bristle Whistle Challenge, but they would play the sounds A through F, and they would try to match and verbally say to me which color matched which letter, which color spectrogram with the borders. I had to give them a way to communicate it to me verbally because this is just PowerPoint, but you can actually do a lot of interaction with PowerPoint, much to my surprise. So it worked out really well. People were pretty good at it. And so they were meant to be matching these together. I see someone's commenting. Yep. So, and then I then gave, it went too far, sorry. Okay, so then I gave other types of matching exercises as well, and it was structured a bit differently than I'm showing you here because I'm giving you a quick summary of everything I did over the past several years. So they kind of intermix between playful and structured gameful experiences to try and understand how they interacted with these different types of media. So in stages, I would show them first two spectrograms, then I showed them four spectrograms, and then I provided sounds and had them match the sounds, and then I provided the photos. You're just seeing one of the end pages, and they would have the opportunity to now match them all up. But it was a very stepwise process. It's referred to as scaffolding when you make it very stepwise in the way that you work people through different interactions. So I did a very scaffold approach to the gaming part of it. And I'll do this again just for fun because we have a moment. So again, I'm imagining a lot of you in Brisbane would know what that bird is. I'm hoping, can you guys, I hope you can hear that okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great. And let me play. And I should mention, I very strategically chose my species. This was not random. I chose one that I knew would really be ubiquitous and loud, being everywhere in the Brisbane area. I worked with all Brisbane people. And I chose one that I thought, oh, people mix this up a lot. And then I chose one that I knew people would probably be familiar with if they tromped around rainforests at all in the area. And then I included bristlebirds, of course. And through all of my encounters, I should say, only two people knew calls of bristlebirds by ear, which is really instructive because I worked with a lot of people. And so over the years anyway, and I did even go to an Australian wildlife sound recordist group camp out, and there were heaps of people there, and there was one fella there who had actually recorded some wild bristlebird calls and was willing to share them with me, which was very exciting if you're a nerd like me. But anyway, I share this because, and I'll let you know what they are. The one in the upper right hand is called a magpie lark or a peewee. It has two names. And that's the one that commonly gets mixed up with things like butcher birds and magpies, even though to me they seem entirely different. They're all black and white. That's why people mix them up. And then we've got our sulfur-crested cockatoo in the middle there, and down on the lower left-hand side, we've got our eastern whip bird. That's the one with the really high crack at the end there. And then we've got our little eastern bristlebird for those curious. And then an example in the Bristle Whistle Challenge of playful interactions is this one. I just showed them a menagerie of bristlebird calls that I had found. And one thing I want to highlight for you on this page, I'm not going to go through them all because I don't have time, unfortunately, but I can at the end if you want. And What I want you to notice here, though, is these birds have an incredibly diverse repertoire. And that's the takeaway here, because that also translates to machine learning being very, very difficult. And one thing to think about as well, and one person within the EcoSounds lab that was visiting briefly attempted to make a recognizer for me to even narrow down how much data I would need to go through. And it was a very difficult task because they had so much diversity. And the more diversity they have, the more of a large, accurate data set you need to be able to train that data. And the other thing to think about is, remember I showed you those soundscape calls, the false color spectrograms. Those are called soundscapes when they're showing the whole sound of the entire ecosystem like that. And it's interesting because their habitats from the wild next to each other have very different acoustic appearances. And also, my stuff was all from kind of a relatively urban area, artificial for them because they're in captivity. So it would have been a very different recognizer if it was built on the captive bird data, but also across habitats. One recognizer may not work from one location to another because it takes in all the information for the entire soundscape, not just the bird's calls. So it just goes to show the complexity. This is not an easy problem to solve. And even if we have a magic bullet of a recognizer, the data still needs to be annotated like this. People need to go through and verify that what the machines are telling us is accurate. So even if in an ideal world recognizers work, we still need these types of tools to be able to make sure that what we think the machine is telling us is actually what it's telling us. And so another playful way that I engaged people is I had them think about a Rorschach or an inkblot test and say to them, hey, could you creatively name the shape of this call? And I'll go ahead and give you guys a quick second. Does this remind you of anything? So I had a number of people come up with loads of ideas on these. And what I found through this actually is even if I couldn't see what certain people saw, it was amazing how often people came up with the same things. And so people regularly said flower for this one. And then I would have people look at soundscapes, little 30-second clips of audio, and say, is there a bristlebird in here? So this was the bristlebird quest part of the Bristle Whistle challenge. And I've shown you here, I've given you the answers. The ones circled in brown within the 30 seconds are Eastern bristlebirds. But what the most amazing learning was from all of this was the fact that they used the names they created when they were talking about the calls that they found in here, which might sound minor, but what it really shows, audio is already a really abstract form of data, especially when you then convert it into a visual. And people had a really good time being creative to make meaning of the sound in a completely different way than I would have thought of before as a scientist. I never would have thought about, gee, how should we design citizen science in the future to have creative opportunities for people? And I wouldn't have even known what that meant in terms of making sense of scientific data, right? As we would think about it as spectrograms. So that was a really important insight from me, and that all came from a conversation showing a gentleman a picture of a spectrogram on paper and saying, "Can you tell me what bird this is?" And he goes, "No, but it looks like car tracks." And I was driving home and thinking, car tracks, that's like a Rorschach test. And it led to this whole exploration. So I wanted to demonstrate this on this page to say, this is the through line of my research. Every little bit that I learned through each encounter with each person informed what I put in this prototype and then the insights that I got out of it. So it was a very collaborative effort, but it was collaborative over the whole group, not necessarily the same group of people. Because as soon as I found out I wasn't going to be helping bristlebirds in the end, I decided to disengage, to not take up time of conservationists that are already really strapped for time and desperately needing to focus on the task at hand that they have. So, but I did some of this with them before that. So, I just mean to say, like, when we talk about participatory design, a lot of the times it's focused on, a specific set of people through the whole thing. But for me, it was a collective knowledge endeavor. Okay, so now in the articulation phase, in the past couple of months, I've been really deeply thinking about this. But overall, if we just focus, and I encourage you to look at my thesis once it's out formally, if you would like my deeper thoughts on this. But if we're focusing on the objectives of my study, coming back to those, I definitely learned a whole heap of opportunities and challenges relating to the transdisciplinary research with that participatory mindset in that context of conservation. And I definitely came out with an understanding of the needs for integrating audio technologies into the practices of the Eastern Bristlebird Recovery Team for the conservation of the species. They don't have the capacity to do it unless somebody can create recognizers for them, or they have a system that is super usable that they can share out with heaps of people far and wide and get help. And even if they have a recognizer, they should still have that system and still be checking what their recognizer tells them, so that the recognizer results need to be integrated into that system so that it can be validated. And that was one of the big things, as an example limitation of eco sounds. There was no mechanism to validate data, and there was not mechanisms to provide any more tag than species, and you couldn't sort the different types of tags. So beyond more than one tag per annotation. So it was a really big barrier. Beyond the knowledge barriers that I've described here in terms of engagement and capacity and the ability to learn the calls, we need tools that support people being able to gain knowledge about the calls before they ever engage with actually validating anything, but also just understanding what a spectrogram is and how to make sense of it. I probably should have explained that in more detail. I'm realizing right now, but nevertheless, understanding, for example, that the level of darkness of the call showing up is a reflection of amplitude. Amplitude is loudness. And so just those little things, when I gave them a spectrogram without axes on it, I got some pretty fun and wild interpretations of how you would interpret a spectrogram. But none of the tools that I'm aware of actually walk you through what a spectrogram is and how to read it. So things like that, but also creating experiences that are enticing. And we need strategies that are both enticing and informative, as I've gone through above, but also I really understood new complexities about the boundaries between human and machine knowledge, and also how that has the potential to influence bristlebirds, because humans base their actions on data. But if that data is not accurate, the actions might be wrong. So just really thinking about it more deeply from that technology lens. So conclusions wise, as I mentioned before, I'm going to get a little broad here, but this is just a tip of the iceberg. I realize this is a tiny little sliver of a much bigger picture of work that needs to be done to really understand how to do this. And this work was very exploratory on purpose, by design, trying to understand the fundamental underpinnings of how people interact with information. So there need to be a lot more studies to look at how to actually create the systems in ways that would function to be useful as well. And that is beyond the scope of what I could really get into here. So there are a plethora of opportunities for design researchers to support nature conservation and nature connection, but and there are also plenty of opportunities for ecologists, computer scientists, and others facilitating citizen science to rethink how systems are created and can be reconfigured to be more meaningful and more powerful in informing conservation. And design and scientific research approaches can be complementary if focused on each other's understanding each other's ways of knowing and common interests. A lot of the times when you read in the literature, it's always spoken about as being antithetical, being in contradiction to one another. And that may be true if you're looking at it from the lens of how the research is done and whether you're looking to understand specific people's practices and ways of knowing, or if you're looking to generalize. But if we look at the end goal and we work together towards the end goal, I feel that is incredibly powerful. So I would like to thank every single one of you for being here because it's very weird to do this remotely, but I'm so, so freaking grateful. I can't even begin to tell you. And I have tons of people to thank, so please bear with me. But my champion participants taught me more than I could ever express and reconfigured my own brain. My supervisors gave me the opportunity and many lessons of many varieties. I want to specifically say thank you, Margot, for sticking it out and doing the slog with me for all these years and not losing faith in me. I'm about to cry. And Dave for keeping me ecologically grounded, man. And also, I just want to say, Selene, even though she's not here, she really helped me with two of those papers, introducing me to this idea of gameful and playful design, and I didn't know anything about it. And to Paul for just giving me the scholarship because I wouldn't have been able to do it at all without that. So I also want to thank my lab members for their support. And just yesterday, I had a couple jump on and help me out getting ready. So just a manifestation that you all have my back and my global village, man. This has been a hard journey for me on so many levels that some of you know in detail, but there's a whole hell of a lot of you that kept me fed, housed, happy, and moving. So thank you to everyone. You know who you are. And my funders, and I'm really grateful because I also was very lucky and fortunate in getting several funding from the Shuttleworth Foundation, and shout out to Alexander Davies for that, Alistair Davies for that, and Wildlife Queensland and BirdLife Australia, and Gaia Resources. Thank you, Piers Higgs, for funding me to travel and meet people and recruit people that I really needed to engage with to make this work a reality. So with that, do you have questions?
All right. First of all, thank you, Jessie, and well done. And I should explain the process here, how we do this at QUT.